So now that we've gone over the different types of individual data points, combining those individual data points into vectors, we're going to move on to kind of a step up from that, matrices. A matrix is just a grid of data, and it can be any type of data. It all just has to be the same. So just like each individual vector has to be only one type of data, every value in a matrix has to be of the same type. So it can be full of numbers, it can be full of strings, it just has to all be the same type. And matrices are always squares or rectangles, so that just means each column and each row are the same length as all the others. There are easy ways to create matrices in R using the function matrix. You first input your data that you're using, then the number of rows you want, and then the number of columns. So here I've created some data. I called it mdata numeric because it's going to be numbers, and I've created a sequence from 1 to 20 in steps of 2. So if I run that, it'll show up in my global environment over here. And if I want to, I can check that out. And here's where I'll tell you a shortcut, because it can get tiresome to write mdata numeric over and over again. So if I just start typing mdata and I press tab, it'll autocomplete for me. And if I have multiple things that start with the letter M, so say I had mdata numeric, but then I also said mdata is 4. And I set that, then I would start typing and I'd hit tab and it would give me a drop down menu and I can choose either of those. So now that I've created the data that I want to put into a matrix, I'm going to write the matrix function, which will be matrix parentheses, and then I'll say, I'm going to put in my data and data numeric. I'm going to say, okay, I'll have 2 rows and 5 columns, and I've saved it into matrix 1. And now you can see in my environment box up here, before I had values. So all these down here are vectors and individual numbers, but now I've created a whole new section called data. And this is where matrices and data frames and larger sets of data are going to show up. So you can also see this little box shows up. If I click this, it'll open up my data in a new window, and then I can look at it in a bit of a cleaner format than just looking at it down here in the console. Another way of viewing that, aside from just clicking this box, is if I say view, and then I put this within parentheses, and I run this, it'll open it up in a new window. And I like doing this just to check when I've subsetted my vectors or subsetted my data frames. It's nice to see it in here as opposed to the console because it's much cleaner and easier to read. I'm going to create another example for you using strings instead of numbers. So here I've created some data, mdata text, and I've saved it by concatenating 4 different strings, and I just used random words. Now what I'm going to do is save my matrix into a variable called matrix2. And you can just run this without saving it into a variable, but I always like saving it because then you can go back to it. If you just run this, all it does is show up in the console, and then you can't really use it in any other situations. So it's best if you save it into a variable, because then you can go back later, and if you want to do something to this matrix, you can just do it to this variable and not have to type this whole thing over again. So here I've taken my text data. I've said that I want 2 rows and 2 columns. And now I'm going to run that. And you can see this is another common mistake actually that I tend to make all the time, is I'll write multiple lines of code and then just run the last one thinking it's going to work. But it doesn't know that this is typed yet because I haven't run the code. So I have to click here and run that. And now this will work. And so if I run matrix 2 now, it's created a matrix 2 by 2 with all of my strings in it. Another important thing to note here is that it creates it by column. So you can see that it's gone down the row here and it said potato, then flour in the first column, and then it went on to the second column. But if you wanted it to do the opposite way around, if you wanted it to go by rows instead of columns, what you can do is put in here. But if you wanted to do it the other way around, you wanted it to go by rows instead of columns, you can type by row equals true and run that. And it switches the order. So then it goes by rows instead of columns. So as you can see down in the console, at the tops and the sides of each of these rows and columns, you can see blank space, comma 1, blank space, comma 2, 1, comma 2, comma. Those are the names of the rows and columns. In R, whenever you are referring to a position in a data frame or a matrix, it's always going to be row, comma, column. So this is the first column, the second column, first row, second row. But say you wanted those to be named and not just random numbers. So here I've created 3 vectors that I'm going to use, just some random numbers, and then some names of columns. So I'm going to name my rows right-handed and left-handed. And this isn't a function here, it's just a random name that I've chosen to call it row names. And then I've named a vector called column names, tall and short. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new matrix. So I'm going to call it tall short. I'm going to say matrix. Here's where my data is. So I'm using some numbers, which are these. Then I'm saying I want 2 rows and 2 columns. And this stands for dimension names. So I'm going to make my dimension names row names as the row names, which is why I named it that, and the column names as the names of the columns. So if I select this, because it's 2 lines, I have to select the whole thing to run it. And then if I view tall short, instead of it being 0, 1, 0, 2, 1, 2, it named those columns and rows tall, short, and right-handed, left-handed.
In this lesson, we learned what a matrix is, how to make one, and how to name its columns and rows. And in our next lesson, we're going to go even further with matrices. We're going to learn how to find values within one and how to manipulate, combine, and apply functions to a matrix.